I'm interested in what you guys would probably call the backup plan, which is, if we don't come up with new anti-aging treatments fast enough, and indeed for, the 70 million people who'll die this year, or the hundreds of thousands of people who die a day or so, we're going to need some more sort of radical treatments and options than just anti-aging drugs or therapies. When we talk about surviving, when we talk about treating aging, when we talk about living longer, the question is what is it even during normal life that lets us survive over time? It's quite complicated if you start thinking about it. On the one hand, we feel like we have the same body, right, over time. But we eat and we drink and we breathe and we excrete, and we're constantly changing out what we're physically made of, such that, our skin's replaced every few weeks, our bone turns over a few percentage per year, and after about a year and a half, you've replaced the full body mass that you're made of with new atoms, new molecules, and new stuff. So it's not just by being made of the same stuff. And when you ask people to really ponder, what actually is important to still make you the same person that you were when you're 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, on consideration, people start to say, I think it's actually psychological properties. It's things like I hold on to my memories. I have the same, way of being conscious. I have the same personality, goals, dreams, desires, those sorts of things. And if you take that sort of psychological view of survival and personal identity seriously, then you turn to what enables those things. How do I hold on to my memories even though I have, breaks in consciousness when I sleep or undergo anesthesia, or, I have changed my body over time? And the way in which that happens is essentially these things are stored in the structures of my brain. So what makes me different from either of you two is that the connections between my neurons have a slightly different pattern of synaptic connections with a different set of neurons that store different information about different experiences I've had and, different ways of initially developing from someone else. And that entire set of differences in brain structure, neuroscientists call a connectome, the same way we call the full set of someone's genes their genome. And ultimately, I think what matters for survival is that somebody holds on to their connectome.
What we are makes a crucial difference to the ways in which we may scientifically overcome death. Today's guest is Dr. Ariel Zeleznikow-Johnston, a cognitive neuroscientist and research fellow at the Monash Neuroscience of Consciousness Lab in Monash University in Melbourne, Australia, where he explores the neural basis of consciousness. He is also the author of The Future Loves You and How and Why We Should Abolish Death, published last year, 2024, that argues that death, as the loss of personal identity, is a solvable problem. We are pleased to hear that. Ariel, welcome to Levity.
Thanks for having me on.
So this is your remarkable book, The Future Loves You, How and Why We Should Abolish Death. Yeah, everyone should get the copy. Now, in this book, you introduce us to Jonathan, who is 190 years old, and he lives on the island of St. Helena off the coast of Africa. I think that's where Napoleon was incarcerated for a while, right? So he's 190 years old and he's active and he enjoys his life. He even has 2 girlfriends, and you say you are jealous of him. Can you explain?
People who are interested in longevity, in medicine, in life extension, any of these things, the question is why bother? Why not just let life take its course? Why try and intervene in nature and the natural bodily processes and aging and any of this stuff? And the reason why I'm interested in doing so, and I think so many people are interested in doing so, is because, at least for many of us, much of the time, life can be pretty good. It can involve seeing your friends and family. It can involve eating delicious meals, playing video games, reading books, pursuing one's goals, one's passions, any of these sorts of things. And it's just, ideally, under the good circumstances, life is something that hopefully we can enjoy. And I think Jonathan sort of outlines the case for why it is that it's not obvious that there ever reaches a point where people are typically finished with their lives and ready to die, except in the absence of, bad stuff happening to them, their bodies breaking down, them getting sick, them having low quality of life, and no longer being in a position where they can or desire continue living with the bodies that they have. So one of the earliest stories in the book that I talk about, as you mentioned, is this tale of Jonathan, this 190-year-old tortoise, that's the spoiler, who's still living in reasonably good health, living on the beach, going around, hiking around the island. And I think it really highlights the idea of if we could all live on beach islands in good health sort of indefinitely, I certainly would. And I think there's a pretty large chunk of people who'd like to take that option.
Yeah, I mean, already Aristotle, he was accused by some Stoic of being kind of envious of animals that live longer than humans. And I definitely share that sentiment. I mean, what is a tortoise or a whale doing with their time? I mean, compared to what I could do.
Yeah, I mean, that's not to say I think that hedonistic pleasures of sitting around, eating vegetables, lying on the beach are the only things in life worth enjoying. If I had a couple of 100 years, it might also be nice to, pursue some art projects or help deal with problems in the world like poverty, injustice, any of these sorts of things. But it's merely to say that even if one could only enjoy these hedonistic pursuits, like sitting on the beach or eating ice cream, even that sounds like it would be pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, like not being in pain and just watch the clouds drift or lay on your back on the lawn, I think is reason enough to not want to be dead.
Yeah, I agree.
For sure. But not everyone agrees. And you talk about certain kind of learned helplessness. Well, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so the question is, if you and I and Peter agree that, life can be good much of the time and we'd like to live longer, the question I have is why aren't more people working on trying to prevent aging, stop death, help people live longer? And it's a bit odd because on the one hand, there is actually a lot of people working on this. I think healthcare consumes something like 10% of global GDP. There's hundreds of billions of dollars put into medical research, things like cancer, dementia, heart disease. And yet there's very, very little money that goes into actually working on aging specifically. So it seems like, for any particular disease, we're we don't want to die of cancer. We don't want to die of heart disease. When there's the writing's on the wall with a particular issue, we know that people probably would like to treat that if they could. But when it comes to, broadly tackling the project overall, there's the disconnect. Now, my suspicion, and what I talk about in the book, is that the reason why this is the case is because as a species, as cultures, we've just come accustomed to the fact that, we age and then we die and there's nothing we can do about it. And so we've come to normalize that to a much greater degree than we do for any specific disease. So that's the phenomenon of learned helplessness. And it's analogous to, there's some psychological experiments where people have taken animals, they've put them in stressful, painful situations in which they can't escape. And in these situations, the animals will initially try to escape. But after a while, they just sort of give up and lie down and whimper. And then if you change their environment so that an escape route becomes possible, what you'll find is the animals that have been pre-trained to not even try and escape, they don't even try once a new strategy becomes available to them because they've sort of learned to be helpless in that scenario. That's what I think is happening with respect to aging and death to a large degree as well. And there's some other examples from medical history of this as well, like how anesthesia took a surprisingly large time to be developed because people thought it would be impossible for a long time. And there's a bunch of other cases throughout history if you go looking for them.
I mean, it's a great example with the animals who they could leave the cage, but they will not because they've learned that they can't. I think that's a fantastic metaphor, perhaps, for the situation we are in right now, where who knows, maybe we could have already been on the way of solving aging.
I also thought that you made a very good point in the book by pointing out that we're spending so much money on people that we know are going to die anyway, within a year even. So it's not like we don't want to help these people. It's just that we're allocating resources in a really, really maligned way, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's clear we have an incoherent strategy when it comes to pursuing medical research for the sort of people who are in very risky scenarios or already who are terminally ill. Where on the one hand, we're willing to spend huge amounts of money on sort of cancer treatments which have pretty low chances of success. Like you'll often see large amounts of research and funding going into treatments that cost tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars that buy people only a few more years. Or similarly, you'll find large amounts of money being spent on terminally ill patients in the last few months of their lives. And it's rare that we say, oh, we should just abandon these people. It's not worth the money to be treating them at this stage. And indeed, that's not what I believe. I think we should be giving people as much time and comfort as we can wherever we can. It's just a weird thing to do. And then at the other hand, not put more money into fundamental basic aging research or even weirder things like the brain preservation that I talk about because you think that's not worth funding or pursuing.
90% of deaths in developed countries are due to age-related diseases. You seem allergic to the notion of healthy aging.
Yeah, I think it's an oxymoronic term. It's a bit hard to describe anything healthy when it leads to an exponential risk of disease.
You should call it the slowest possible age-related disease progression or something like that.
Yeah, it's a bit of a cumbersome term.
Yeah,
but yeah.
And they call it for what it really is. So, but some people say, well, yeah, but the opposite to death is just a much worse situation where we have all these old people hanging around and they're slowing down society and innovation and causing overpopulation, all that. So you're not worried about those things?
No, that's not true. I am worried about the objections and the concerns when it comes to extending lives, either for a few more years, decades, centuries, indefinitely. I think it's always worth taking seriously the consequences and complications of new technologies, changes to the status quo. I just think it's the case that when you look at them as a whole, some of them I think are serious but can be mitigated, and many of them are overblown, I think, compared to at least the benefits that could be derived. Because on the one hand, you have the prospect of being able to give people more time, empower them to live their lives as they see fit, which is a pretty compelling, positive. That's the argument we make for treating any particular disease. And on the other hand, you have concerns like overpopulation, sort of social concerns like overpopulation or wealth concentration or political power concentration. If people can continue living indefinitely, there's nothing to, stop them from accumulating power and resources. And then you have individual sort of concerns about, if people live longer, would their lives lose meaning? Would they become bored? Would they just not know what to do with themselves, I guess? And it's kind of, I think each of these is worth seriously considering and looking at in turn. I just think once you do that, you realize that, that they're probably not as bad as dying.
There's a kind of taboo that stretches back millennia of a tradition of just finding various excuses on behalf of aging and death to say, well, it looks bad, but it really is the best thing for us. And of course, with your beautiful image, it really is like two rats in the cage saying, it looks like we could get out of the cage, but let's not try it. It's kind of comfy in here, isn't it? Right? Or,
Yeah. Well, I'm interested. So in your book, you describe it as the wise view.
Yeah.
You sort of ironically give it that label.
Yeah.
I use a slightly different terminology in that I consider it, the neologism I guess I make is palliative philosophy, where it's essentially, I think, people trying to find ways to comfort themselves, given that they think that they are definitely going to die. This, what superficially seems to be a scary, disempowering, painful process, If that is going to happen, the question is, maybe is there anything that can mitigate how terrible it is? And that's sort of like a palliative process. In the same way that, if somebody has some sort of painful procedure they have to endure, if there's nothing we can do for them, we might try and palliate them by giving them something that will at least mask the pain. And the example I give in the book is, again, to mention anesthesia. Prior to the invention of surgical anesthesia, there were still circumstances where people needed an amputation or childbirth or all sorts of like quite painful procedures or processes happening to their body. And it wasn't the case that doctors and surgeons would necessarily say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, this is horrible, this is painful, it's going to happen to you, there's just like nothing that can be done, but it's truly terrible that it's happening." Instead, what you'd often find is people said, no, the pain is actually good for you. It's part of the healing process, or it's a necessary part of this condition to get through it. And that's sort of like, if there's nothing else you can do for someone, I guess maybe that does provide some comfort or some palliation. It just becomes horrific if the circumstances change and it turns out, other interventions could actually treat the condition.
Yeah, but it's like philosophers and others who make these palliative philosophy arguments, they've drunk the Kool-Aid. They actually believe in them.
Yeah, I wonder to what degree this sort of stuff is really true, though. I think the vocal ones are the ones who say that. But I am reminded of, there's like a survey of philosophers by Bourget and Chalmers from, I think, 2000 or so, where they did ask, at least analytical philosophers, I think like over 1,000 of them, would you take immortality if given the chance? And about half of them say yes. So like, I think there's quietly probably quite a lot of people who are sympathetic to our cause here.
Yeah. You could say that, because I would say that the common sense and the instinctual response is that it's better to be youthful and alive than to be old or dead. Fewer philosophers have felt the need to make that argument. And so it hasn't really been made very much. So all the arguments have been made on the what you call the palliative side. I think palliative philosophy, it's a great neologism that you come up with. One of a few concepts that I think I'm going to borrow as I go forward. There are others in the book as well. Very, very like learn helplessness, as we already talked about. I think that's a good image of what's going on. But I do think that a lot of people do have drunk the Kool-Aid too and persuaded themselves to be passive, and because you can see that even organizations that talk about longevity and so on, they rarely mention death, and often they don't mention like anti-aging directly, or it still has a kind of a stigma or something. I mean, it could be, of course, the tradition has been full of quackery.
I think there was a paper in the Lancet a few years ago that was talking about death as a blessing in disguise. Do you know what paper I'm talking about, Ariel?
Yeah, it's the Lancet Commission on the Value of Death, which was a paper that summarized the commission of this prestigious medical journal. It's sort of like a white paper on palliative care practice and necessity. And it's funny when I read it, because I'm like 99% on board with everything that the people on the panel and the commission are trying to do. They're trying to advocate for, sort of increased thinking about aging and death, for increased resources available for people at end of life, for all these sorts of good ways of empowering patients. It's only really in the last 1% where we like dramatically veer off course, where I'm saying this whole thing is like terrible. We really need to be helping people, empowering people. And so that's why we should pursue more treatment options available for them. And they say, this whole process is under-resourced and people get really disempowered and scared. And so what we have to recognize is that there's value in death and dying too. And I think it is a case of drinking the Kool-Aid, as Patrick said, because they even make claims. I think some direct quotes are things to the effect of, it is healthy to die, is one. And another one is, without death, every birth would be a tragedy. Which sounds unhinged when you take it out in isolation. And indeed, people do always laugh when I take these quotes and give them to them. But I think I can sort of understand where these palliative care doctors are coming from when they feel that their work and what they're trying to provide to people is being so devalued. And they feel that the need that these patients have to have, comfort and meaning is so high that they end up getting them into this absurd position.
That's the scary thing about being us rational and reason-giving creatures, is that we can justify absolutely any position, as we have all through history. We've justified the most absurd positions, and they seemed almost commonsensical at the time, right? And often something has to happen on the ground to change. Some facts have to change, or some scientific possibilities have to change before we change our minds. And that's where we are today, because facts are changing and possibilities, scientific and technical possibilities are changing rapidly. And I think your book is somewhat of a reaction to that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. That's the case. The book, in brief, it goes through stuff that I'm sure many of your other guests have talked about before. So why it is that we age, how we might be able to, like the various ideas people have around how that could be treated, potentially, why we might want to do so, and then what we expect that to look like going forward. I guess the key difference between what I talk about, though, and what your other guests talk about is I'm interested in what you guys would probably call the backup plan, which is, if we don't come up with new anti-aging treatments fast enough, and indeed for, the 70 million people who will die this year, or the hundreds of thousands of people who die a day or so, we're going to need some more sort of radical treatments and options than just anti-aging drugs or therapies.
So what is it you're proposing that we should do? How do I, death is rapidly approaching me. How do I avoid it?
Yeah, so if someone is terminally ill, I think they should have access to a procedure that's essentially capable of ideally putting them in a kind of stasis where they're unaging, unchanging, basically inert until such time as future medical advances are able to restore them to health. Now, that sounds like an extremely science fiction proposal, which I'm aware of. But what I talk through in the book is a specific procedure called preservation or brain preservation, which essentially has as its core idea the idea that it might be possible to take a person and to stabilize the structures in their brain, that hold on to their memories, their personality, all their psychological properties, all the things that make them them. And in stopping those things from decaying, hold on to the essence of a person for as much time as is needed, as to then be able to hopefully one day restore them to health.
I'm sure we're going to spend a lot of time talking about this proposal of yours, but could we put it in some context? I think that a lot of people, when they hear you talk about this, immediately think, oh, this is cryonics. It's been around for I don't know, 60 or 70 years or so. But you line out the differences with your proposal and what cryonics is in the book. Could you briefly give us a tour here, and so just to put it in context?
Yeah. So as you say, I'm sure many of your listeners have heard of this general sort of space of ideas before. And indeed, there is a history where, the original ideas people had around about putting people into stasis with the hope of being able to restore them to health later were around using cold temperatures. Because we know from the natural world that if you cool stuff down, put it in the fridge or the freezer or in ice, that's what we use to preserve stuff. And there's even, natural circumstances where there are some frogs, for example, that, every winter they essentially freeze and then they thaw themselves out. Come spring, go back to hopping around. So yeah, the idea of cryonics has been around since I think at least the 1960s or so, and it's become more sophisticated over time, where originally it started with sort of straight freezing ideas. It moved on to, and we can get into the technical details if you want later, but it moved on to things like cryopreservation and vitrification, so ice-free methods of cooling. Unfortunately, those still have some issues with them. And another sort of proposal, and one I go through in the book in more detail, is this chemical preservation technique, which instead of using cold temperatures, uses sort of preservative chemicals, which lead to much better brain structure preservation. So they're more compatible with ways in which you think that the synapses are still there, the neural connections are still there, at least in a way that you can verify to a greater degree of quality than with traditional cryonics approaches. But in a general sense, it is part of the broad camp of, I don't know, cryonics, biostasis, preservation. It's got quite a few different names at this stage.
And you talk about something called not vitrification, but vitrifixation. And it's essentially what you just mentioned, that you have a chemical stabilizer along with vitrification.
Yeah, maybe it's worth then going into a little bit of detail about the different technical proposals people have had. So as I mentioned, the earliest proposals in the 60s or so were just to straight freeze tissue, to take samples, lower them down to liquid nitrogen temperatures or so, and then hope that they were preserved doing that. The issue with straight freezing biological tissues is that you get ice formation, so ice crystals grow. Those ice crystals, they puncture cells, they can cause damage. They also concentrate, stuff that isn't dissolved. So they cause a lot of problems. Over time, people moved to doing what's called vitrification, which is where you add antifreeze or cryoprotectants to tissues before lowering them down to cold temperatures. And that's great because it prevents the ice formation that causes damage. Instead, stuff just solidifies into a sort of glass-like amorphous solid. And that's what we use these days for in procedures like IVF, to do things like preserving sperm and eggs and embryos for indefinite periods of time. There's been circumstances where embryos have been preserved for decades these days, and then, led to live births, successful pregnancies, that sort of thing. The issue, though, is that vitrification has difficulty scaling up to larger and larger tissue samples. So we don't currently use vitrification on, organs for organ banking, for transplantation purposes. And the reason why is because, for two different reasons. One is that the cryoprotectants themselves, the chemicals, can be somewhat toxic to cells. The second reason is that they can cause dehydration. They pull the water out of larger organs in a way that gets worse with the bigger the tissue samples are. And indeed, if you look at modern cryonics techniques done by Alcor or Tomorrow Biostasis, what you will see is that in patients preserved just using cryopreservation or just using vitrification, you'll see something like a 30 to 50% shrinkage of the brains of those patients under preservation. Now, on the one hand, that doesn't guarantee that those brains are destroyed and that the memories and personality and all the information within there is gone. But what it does mean is that it's very hard to verify that the structures are still intact. So if you look at tissue samples taken from those brains under an electron microscope, so under very powerful microscopes, they look compressed and it's hard to do tracing, and it doesn't look like the typical sort of neuroscience, good quality images we're used to seeing. So that then brings me to, well, what do I mean by those good images we're used to seeing? Those come from using different procedures called fixation, where instead of just using cold temperatures, what you instead do is you introduce preservative chemicals into an animal or a person's body. Basically, you get them into the bloodstream, they permeate everywhere, and then they lock everything in place. They bind to proteins and other biomolecules, they prevent any further chemical reactions and sort of decay processes, they render everything inert. And through doing that, you get much better quality preservation, at least under just sort of ideal circumstances that have been tried. So that's the difference between chemical fixation and cryopreservation vitrification procedures.
But a combination is used today, right?
Yes, so you can combine the two together, where you do the initial fixation, and then in doing that initial fixation, it prevents the dehydration process that can happen with the cryonics procedures that happen later, so that the cryopreservation that happens later. And the reason for doing that might be that, the fixation might not stop 100% of all processes. Maybe some of the oily molecules can slip around the fixed bonds, that sort of thing. Although it's actually increasingly unclear whether that is a problem, and people are considering storing these fixed bodies at warmer temperatures, still cold, but something like minus 40 degrees Celsius or minus 20 degrees Celsius, rather than having to go all the way down to, minus 140 or below, as they do in cryopreservation.
This episode of Levity is brought to you by Vitalism Foundation.
Vitalism Foundation is a non-profit with a revolutionary mission to achieve unlimited lifespans in peak health.
It's a community of action driven by vitalism, a new moral philosophy whose first tenet is that life and health are good, death is humanity's core problem, and aging its primary agent. They're one of the few groups that truly understand aging as the emergency that it is.
Vitalism's goal is nothing short of monumental: to allocate 1% of global GDP to this project. It's ambitious, but it's exactly what's needed to tackle aging head-on.
As a member of Vitalism, you'll get access to a private community, exclusive content, and invites to special conferences. Plus, you'll receive insider prices on longevity wellness services from Vitalism's mission-aligned partners.
But more than that, you will be supporting a mission that's too important to leave to others to tackle.
So you should really join us. Follow the link in the description below. For a limited time, you get 30% off forever. Just use the promo code LEVITY at checkout.
Again, that's 30% off forever with the promo code LEVITY. Let's make a difference together.
Do you know if the big cryonics or biostasis providers today use this method already or are going to use it? Why hasn't this been done previously?
Yeah, so for a few different reasons. So one is that, some of these organizations like Alcor are just older and they've been using cryopreservation, which has been around for some time. The other sort of objection is that it, at least initially, seems harder to imagine doing biological revival with a fixation style procedure. So the hope with something like cryopreservation is in the same way that we can freeze down embryos or vitrify embryos and then thaw them out and warm them back up again, and they're immediately viable. People have always hoped that we could do the same thing with human bodies, where we'd be able to just rapidly cool them and then at some point warm them back up again and they directly go back to, their function. Maybe with some medical assistance, some drugs, some procedures, but in a fairly straightforward biological way. And that's sort of more enticing if you imagine doing it with something that's just using cold temperatures and maybe some antifreeze. It becomes less tenable, or at least conceptually less tenable, when you start introducing preservative fixative chemicals into the picture. Because what those do is they really, at a molecular level, sort of bind things together to prevent decay processes. Now, on the one hand, that's good because it leads to very high quality preservation of structure. You can see those structures under a microscope. Looks like everything we think involved with memory storage is still there. But on the other hand, it's conceptually, more challenging to think about how you're going to reverse that at some point in the future. You'd need to somehow get in there, reverse those chemical bonds if you wanted to do a direct biological restoration of the person. And it's sort of more compatible with people who think, maybe something like mind uploading might be more viable. Because if you're that way inclined, you're less worried about biological viability and you're, just concerned with storing the information that specifies someone's personal identity. The one last thing I'd say on that, though, is it seems like there's this difference of schools, but actually I suspect that the practice of trying to revive someone who's been vitrified with all that, osmotic shrinkage issues is probably going to be just as hard if you're trying to do biological revival as trying to reverse that chemical fixation. And it's for that reason that some of these organizations are also, increasingly interested in fixation approaches. I know that Tomorrow Biostasis, for example, does fixation in some circumstances. I know they do it with, I think, at least some neurocircumstances. And I think they're considering, if their brain preservation data doesn't look so good in the future, maybe considering doing more fixation style approaches. And there's other groups like Oregon, Brain Preservation, and Connectome on the west coast of the US that are also offering or planning to offer imminently these sorts of procedures.
So there's vitrification, there's chemical fixation, and vitrifixation that you're talking about. So then you alluded to another way that we might survive, and that is to make a kind of digital snapshot of our brain at the time, perhaps just before we are being preserved. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So I guess the promise and prospect of something like preservation, cryonics, biostasis, is essentially it's a two-part proposal. It's saying we want to take people who are terminally ill and preserve them in a way where we think there's a chance that we'll be able to revive them at some point in the future. And we're saying today's technology, even though it's not sufficient to, cure someone's cancer or upload them or do any of these sorts of revival technologies today, what we think it can do is put someone in stasis. It's capable of stopping them from dying in some sense, even if it's not capable of letting them continue to be a dynamic, active, living creature at that particular point in time. And then the question is, if you accept that, there's some chance that might work, then how do you expect the revival to work at some point in the future? And when people think about that, the two main things they speculate are on, one, just directly sort of reversing the preservation, whether that's, just straight warming someone up, or whether it's warming someone up and also using, advanced medicine, nanomachinery to, reverse chemical bonds, reverse shrinkage issues, repair damage, those sorts of things. Or whether it's even other ideas where in the same way we can chew, even if we have false teeth, or we can still hear, even if we have cochlear implants. Maybe you can dispense with the difficulties of biology and, replace the biological components with digital, electronic components that still hold on to someone's psychological properties in a way that they think counts for their survival. So those are the sorts of two ideas people have in mind.
You also, you spend you're a neuroscientist. You spend a great deal of time in the book. It's almost like a page turner. You're leading up to the thing that you're going to reveal, which is the Connectome. But can you talk us through? You're just not saying that we should preserve our bodies and brains in a special way. You have a specific reason for why we should preserve, especially our brains, in this specific way, and this comes from your line of work, right? So can you talk us through that?
Yeah, I think the question is when we talk about surviving, when we talk about treating aging, when we talk about living longer, the question is what is it even during normal life that lets us survive over time? On the one hand, that seems like a trivially obvious answer. It's I don't know, I keep living, I remember, I'm connected, the same stream of consciousness. I don't know, I live. Why are you asking me this? But it turns out that it is quite complicated if you start thinking about it. On the one hand, we feel like we have the same body, right, over time. But we eat and we drink and we breathe and we excrete, and we're constantly changing out what we're physically made of, such that, our skin's replaced every few weeks, our bone turns over a few percentage per year, and after about a year and a half, you've replaced the full body mass that you're made of with new atoms, new molecules, and new stuff. So it's not just by being made of the same stuff. And when you ask people to really ponder, what actually is important to still make you the same person that you were when you're 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, on consideration, people start to say, I think it's actually psychological properties. It's things like I hold on to my memories. I have the same, way of being conscious. I have the same personality, goals, dreams, desires, those sorts of things. And if you take that sort of psychological view of survival and personal identity seriously, then you turn to what enables those things. How do I hold on to my memories even though I have, breaks in consciousness when I sleep or undergo anesthesia, or, I have changed my body over time. And the way in which that happens is essentially these things are stored in the structures of my brain. So what makes me different from either of you two is that the connections between my neurons have a slightly different pattern of synaptic connections with a different set of neurons that store different information about different experiences I've had and, different ways of initially developing from someone else. And that entire set of differences in brain structure, neuroscientists call a connectome, the same way we call the full set of someone's genes their genome. And ultimately, I think what matters for survival is that somebody holds on to their connectome, to all this psychological, personal identifying information.
Is that established, or is it a controversial view that saying the connectome is the thing that makes up you or your identity?
I think everything in philosophy is controversial, but it's a very well established view. So if you look at theories of personal identity, so how people survive over time, sort of the main camps are the psychological view, which is, people survive because they hold on to their psychological properties. Even within that, there's different branches. Like some are more like, it's because they have a stream of consciousness. Some are like, it's about memories. Some it's more complicated. But broadly, there's the psychological view. Then there's some who say it's based on bodily continuity, having the same body over time. Then there's other smaller camps as well, like soul-based accounts or other further fact views. But definitely the most prominent one amongst both philosophers and the general public is a psychological view account. And then if you ask, what actually instantiates that, I think it's pretty well established that people think it's, people's connectomes that store their memories, personality, those sorts of things. The exact way in which that's done in the brain is complicated, but in general, it's got something to do with brain structure.
I think it's a great concept. I hadn't heard of it before, actually. Connectome then includes my memories of my childhood and my friends, and that I have this shirt and this conversation we're having and the conversations I've had in the past, but also my preference in music, right? Preference in art, things like that as well. So it's both like what philosophers call like propositional attitudes, that is the kind of beliefs and opinions we have about the world, and but it's also kind of the more visceral and emotional part of ourselves. Is that correct?
Yeah. It's not to say that literally everything that specifies an individual is just in their connectome. So you'll hear things about embodied cognition, for example, or the fact that, people's bodies contribute to their way of being, their sense of self. And that's true. My guts influence my emotions and my way of feeling. My body influences how I move around and interact with the world. But if one accepts that, someone can have a spinal cord injury and become quadriplegic, and while they're still damaged, much of what makes them is still there, because it's one's memories and personality and those sorts of psychological things that are really key to being that person. And if one accepts that psychology depends upon brain structure, which there are now, almost 2 centuries of neuroscience to support this sort of idea, then yeah, it's basically that the vast majority of what's key to making us stems from our connectome, our brain structure.
Before digging deeper on that, when you talk about how we recycle every 1.5 years, so we basically have a new body every 1.5 years, unfortunately errors is creeping in, so we have usually an inferior body every 1.5 years until we have a terrible body, and then we collapse and die rather quickly. But you're also saying that neurons are somewhat of a special case. Can you talk a little bit about how the neurons, because you also say that in some sense our neurons are the same through time.
Yeah, so it is an interesting case. So most cells in your body are replaced, where a cell is sort of an oily bag of proteins that does a particular job. Like your liver cells have enzymes which help clear your blood. Your skin cells help perform a protective barrier. And the cells in your brain, they make connections with each other and they store information. And your liver cells are constantly dying and replacing themselves. Your skin cells are constantly dying and replacing themselves. But your brain cells actually don't in a sense, constantly die and replace themselves. Once they grow, they stick around and they hold on to those connections. So you could try and make the argument that, well, Ariel, you're saying, you discount bodily continuity, but your brain cells are still there and they're still staying around for a long time. Are you sure it's not just that those things are there that makes you who you are? And if you change them, you'd have problems?
So wait.
The problem is...
So that would, just for the listeners, that would, in some sense, support the body view, because the body view includes the brain. So they say, well, it's just that these neurons are always the same. And that's really the red line that makes you through time.
Yeah, that's a good clarification. The issue with that view, though, is then you can just jump down to the next level, where you say, well, are they really the same neurons over time? Because if you look at them, although, they might be in the same position and they might maintain the same connections, their components are actually constantly being replaced as well. So a neuron, a brain cell, is made up of, a layer, which is made of lipids. It's got a cell nucleus, and it's got all these proteins that do jobs like move neurotransmitters along and cause action potentials and do electrical activity, all those sorts of things. And those components themselves are actually being constantly replaced. So like all the structures that make a connection between one neuron and another neuron are being replaced on the order of days to weeks. Now, the connection sticks around, but the connections that make it up are actually changed out, like the molecules are changed out. The only thing that really sticks around for a long time is the DNA sitting at the nucleus of the neuron. But that DNA doesn't specify the connections between the different neurons themselves. It's only sitting around because that cell's no longer replicating, so it doesn't have a chance to get replaced, essentially. It's quite a bit of a nerdy dive into neuroscience.
No, but it's important, and it's like this. It's pushing the question to what makes a neuron the same neuron over time. It's interesting.
One thing that I thought of when I read the book is that I've always I don't know what side to stand on when it comes to mind uploading, and if we're going to see that as if we're copies of ourselves or the same selves. But I guess I realized I'm already a copy of myself in a very literal sense, right?
Yeah, I mean you're made of different stuff, so in that sense you're a copy. I mean it's like, I think these questions are really interesting about what happens with personal identity over the course of someone's natural lifespan, and then what happens in sort of thought experiments, like you walk through the teleporter, you get mind uploaded, you have a twin, any of these sorts of cases. The thing that I would always make clear at the start, although I love getting into these sorts of thought experiments, is that I think that the case for preservation is still pretty strong, no matter what, it ends up your commitments are at the end of these thought experiments. It's only that they constrain the space of possibilities for how you might revive someone from a state of being preserved. Where if you end up accepting lots of different views of survival, then, anything goes. Whereas if you stick to just like a bodily based view, then you're going to have to reverse the preservation procedure eventually. But yeah, it's fun to get into the philosophy.
I think we should. I'd say that it's the mind uploading or the making this kind of digital snapshot method that most of all hinges on our answer to the questions that we'll consider now. You're right. If someone has suffered so much brain damage that all their memories are gone and the remaining personality is completely altered, I would consider the person dead.
So when we're thinking about survival, I think it's worth considering the two sort of extremes, right? So on the one hand, during everyday life, our personalities change and our brains change a bit. So there's all that turnover that I was previously talking about. The proteins change, the exact connections in our brains change. And there's even, a little bits of brain damage that happen to us. We get hit in the head, we have a concussion, minor injuries. We don't generally think of these sorts of changes as killing us as individuals. Even if we have things like, we change which genre of music we like, or we switch jobs or move countries or have cultural changes. Those things don't count as death. But on the other hand, if someone suffered so much brain damage that they'll never be conscious again, they don't seem to have, well, I guess starting off, that they've suffered so much brain damage that they'll never be conscious again. And it looks like everything that supports their memories and personality has been destroyed, then that's nowadays what we would say means brain death. So somebody is gone. And that's a medically accepted view at the moment. Then I guess there's the question of the more intermediate cases. So on the one hand, you can imagine having a little bit less brain damage than brain death, where there's still some function remaining, but somebody has very limited consciousness, and that which they do express, they seem to have a very different personality to what they had before. They've lost all of their memories from their previous experiences. And, their friends and family, when they talk to this person, well, this individual, don't feel as though, the person they knew is still there. I think in that sort of circumstance, it's not unreasonable to ask the question of like, well, does this count for survival? Like, is the individual still there, even if much of their body is still there? And then the question just gets harder and harder the more you walk it back towards more and more material being preserved and their function remaining. That's sort of what I was getting to in the description that you quoted me on. It's not to say I know exactly where to set the line. I think that's really hard and a question for primarily individuals, but also for ethicists, doctors, philosophers, legislators. But more to say that, there's a point past it eventually where we definitely think someone's died, even if, maybe some brain function or structure is still remaining.
But I mean, you also mean, in the passage I read, it wasn't that the consciousness was gone, but it was that it was very altered. Like some of the cases you're describing in the book of patients who suffered various trauma, and then they become very, very different.
No, I agree. There's both real-world examples where, for example, in some sorts of dementia, you can get pretty extreme personality changes, where the circumstances where people who were originally, loving, kind, thoughtful, become extremely arrogant, self-centered, rude. They seem to stop caring about their friends and family. They seem to change really quite a lot, to the point where their, friends or family will say, that's no longer my dad, uncle, friend, whoever anymore. And I think that does bring up the question of, is that still the same person if that amount of damage and change has occurred? And then you can get into more sort of like philosophical thought experiments where, imagine you had a circumstance where, I don't know, you gave someone some sort of magical drug where slowly their personality was completely altered, and they also lost all of their long-term memories, such that after, a year or so, they couldn't remember their previous self, and they had a completely different personality. They were like you picked another person out of a population. I would say in that circumstance as well, even if some of the same physical material is still there, and there was a period of continuity, I guess, in the change, then the original person's died and is no longer present. And I think, my guess is quite a lot of people would support that view.
There's an argument that apologist philosophers, people who like the wise view and the palliative philosophy, they make the argument that, by the time you are 1,000 years old or 200 years old, perhaps you've changed so much that you actually have died. That is, you cannot survive until you're 1,000 years old, because it would be such a different person. So it cannot be in your interest to survive, because you're not surviving until 1,000. There's a different person. So it's not. It might be in that person's interest, or if you imagine that, but it's not in your interest, so to speak. Right? Bernard Williams is making a point like that. But I disagree. So I might be disagreeing with your intuitions here a bit. I think that I'd like to survive to that person 1,000 years from now, even if that person doesn't remember much about this life have now. And I would actually consider that survival.
Yeah, don't you think that, what Ariel is saying is that there's no continuity, but I guess there would be some continuity. So it's not completely a one-to-one comparison here. Am I thinking about this right?
I think there's actually two things going on here. So one is, I actually think people underestimate the degree to which they hold on to psychological properties over time, or at least I think philosophers like Bernard Williams, as you described there, underestimate it, in that within people's lifetimes, their personalities can be pretty stable. So you can measure someone at like 5 and 10 in terms of, how outgoing or extroverted or neurotic they are, and measure them again decades later, and there tends to be a pretty high correlation across that time point. And in the same way, if you go to people in their 60s, 70s, 80s who aren't suffering from dementia, and you ask them to tell you about their childhood or their life story, they tend to hold on to at least the broad strokes quite well. So people do hold on to their psychological properties for a long time. And I imagine if somehow we came up with a way of living for 200, 300, 400 years, we'd want to make sure that those sorts of things were maintained for people so that they could hold on to their memories. Because I think there is a loss to an individual if they can't hold on to those things over time. So that's the first part. The second part, which I think might get to what you're saying, Peter, is that you can think about this issue of continuity where, imagine someone lives for 1,000 years, and at each time point during that period, they have the last 100 years of memories or so. At age 500, they can still remember when they were 400, or age 600, they can still remember when they were 500. In that circumstance, they'd still be motivated to continue living, if only to keep their, at 600, 550-year-old self alive, or 560-year-old self alive, such that there'd always be a window that would motivate their ongoing survival, even if it was the case that I would say that if you're 800, but you only remember and have the personality of your 500-year-old self, then your 200-year-old self really has died. And I think that's where Patrick and I might differ.
I have two questions there. The first one being, or maybe that's not a question, but I think you mentioned it in the book as well. I mean, I don't have that many memories from before I was 5, right? But I don't consider that person to be another person than me.
No, this gets into the really thorny end of the ethics and philosophy here, where there's a lot of challenges to all the views. So the implication of the personal identity view I'm saying is that if you take it back far enough, there really is a point at which that body was not the same as you today. So maybe not 5, because 5-year-olds still have a lot of personality of their 10, 15, 20-year-old self. But you can go further back. You can say, what about 1 or 6 months or 3 months or 0 or 8 months in the womb, 7 months, 3 months in the womb? At some point, the brain hadn't formed, there weren't psychological properties, or those personality things were different. And it's a relevant question to ask, hold on, where do you draw the line going backwards in time? And that's a thorny challenge. Although the challenge sort of exists with every other view as well. For example, if you claim that someone survives based on, having the same body, then it's not really clear why birth should matter. Surely you have the same body as your fetal self, your zygote self, maybe even the sperm and egg from previously. These views all have their issues and challenges.
The other thing I was thinking about, sorry, Patrick, I'm interrupting you all the time here. The other thing I was thinking about, what do we know about, I mean, you talk about memory formation quite a lot in the book and how that works. And from what I understand, these are very, very stable stuff. What do we know about them surviving or keep functioning over a long period of time in a world where we would live to, say, 500 years or 1,000 years?
This is a great question. I think actually what I'd really love to do is to do some psychology experiments on Jonathan the tortoise, or some bowhead whales or Greenland sharks, these sort of creatures that do live a couple of 100 years and do presumably have memories, to see do they hold on to stuff from when they were younger? Can they remember? Because the answer is we just don't know. So in humans, at least, for people who again don't have cognitive decline to a too great an extent, or dementia, we know that people can hold on to memories for decades, that you can ask 80-year-olds about stuff from earlier on in their life. We don't know what would happen if someone got to 100, 200, 300, 400 and was still running on the same sort of brain architecture wetware that we have now. On the one hand, I could go either way. So on the one hand, we know that there's more capacity in the brain than is required for a lot of processes. Like sort of the most dramatic example I think of is we can all, or pretty much everyone these days can read, even though reading was only invented a few thousand years ago. And it sort of piggybacks off the ability to do object recognition. And other sort of examples are often people have quite substantial brain damage and they seem to have very little functional impairment, showing that there's like a lot of redundancy in the brain, and so probably a fair bit of spare capacity that could be used. On the other hand, we know that from artificial intelligence, if you try and pack too much into too small, like an artificial neural network, eventually it saturates and it starts forgetting stuff. And my guess is that at some point, at some age, humans would lose capacity and lose memories, and you'd need to, somehow improve their storage or neuron count or something to let them keep functioning. But this is very speculative.
The connectome, is that similar to the concept of personality that's sometimes used?
There are two different approaches. So personality is a psychological description of the ways in which people tend to display behaviors. So we talk about how someone who's extroverted, for example, and gregarious tends to, be the life of the party, go out, meet new people, as opposed to someone who's maybe conscientious but shy, will be meticulous about their work and stay at home and maybe have a hobby like, stamp collecting or something. I'm playing into stereotypes, but these ideas come from somewhere. On the other hand, Connectome is a biological description of the connections between neurons in the brain. Now, I think the two are related, maybe in the same sort of way that we talked, historically there was thoughts about the kinetic energy of particles, and there was the knowledge of like temperature as like, feeling things and how hot or cold they were. And eventually the two were bridged together and it was realized that these were kind of pointing at the same thing. I don't think the analogy works quite as perfectly for connectome and personality as it does for temperature and kinetic energy, because there's other things the connectome does, like, also your brainstem reflexes are in there, like your body posture and heart rate control and those sorts of things. It really refers to everything the brain holds onto and does. But broadly, yes, I think there's a connection.
Like it constitutes the personality or something like that. Because I was thinking, you mentioned like John Locke and his views, and he had kind of an early version of this, and he was discussing whether it was the soul that made you or something else. And despite being religious, he went for it. No, it's not the soul that makes you. It's actually your personality. It's very interesting. And he said, if God changed your soul constantly, but you still remained with the same kind of personality, he calls it, you would still remain the same, or something, a thought experiment like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a credit to philosophical, analytical rigor, where there's quite a few examples of people centuries before the technologies became relevant, really thinking through stuff properly, and I think coming to the right conclusions. There's another example I talk about in the book where I think Leibniz was reasoning about computer science a couple of centuries before computers were ever built. It's fun. But yeah, I agree where it's, there's real circumstances, as I mentioned, where people have personality changes, brain injuries, all these sorts of things that show personal identity damaging scenarios where the question of like, are they the same person? Have they changed? Really, really do come up in a way that I think argues for personality-based view.
So I'd say that you are not a believer in a soul kind of dualism, but your view is a little bit dualist, because you're saying that we are not identical to our brain. We are the information, so to speak. We are the connection, or the relations, rather. It's quite interesting, because it, of course, takes us to the point where we could exist separately from the body we have.
I guess it's still physicalist in that I think it still needs to be instantiated in a physical medium somehow. There needs to be a brain or a storage mechanism that holds on to this information. But it's true that it's agnostic to, the particular medium. So this would be called substrate independent, or, it's multiply realizable. It's not my particular original biological brain that's the only thing that could enable me to survive. And I think this comes up even today when we're doing things like increasingly have brain implants, neural prostheses that are replacing little bits of people's brains, where, already we're toying with the question of like, if you replace this section, is that them or not them, or what's acceptable? And yeah, that's what motivates me to think, it's the information that matters, not the biology itself.
So I think this takes us to a thought experiment that really puts your view to the test. Ariel, would you explain your intuition here, and then we can see, Peter, what we think.
So there's a couple of different versions of it that I tell. So we'll start with the first one. It's essentially the old question of like, if someone goes through a teleporter that dematerializes them, throws away the bits they're made of, and reconstitutes them at the other end out of new material, is that still the same person or not at the other end? Comes up in discussions of Star Trek, comes up in discussions of Parfit in philosophy, where, intuitions can certainly differ on this question, and particularly depending on how exactly you phrase the thought experiment. So if you're someone who holds the, personality, personal identity is defined by psychological properties, personality view, then it seems like the teleport is fine. You step through at one end, you come out the other, you remember having walked through, there was a break in your consciousness, but the same as, when you sleep or undergo anesthesia. What's the problem? Now you're on Mars, you were on Earth before. No issue. Plenty of people agree with that. If you do surveys and you ask people, the majority say that someone has survived something like that, at least in the general public. Where the difficulty starts to come in, and where people's intuitions sometimes break down, is where you duplicate someone. So somebody walks through the teleporter on Earth, and an individual pops out on Mars on the other end, and they think they've just walked through the teleporter as per normal. But it turns out that when they walk through the teleporter on Earth, the individual there just stepped through, and from their experience, nothing happened. And what happened is that there were two individuals. One was created on Mars, and the original was left on Earth. And now both of these entities feel as though they continue on from the person who stepped through the teleporter in the first place. And now normally people are like, well, hold on. Are they both the same person? Is the one on Mars a copy? What's going on here? It doesn't feel right that you could say that, the one on Mars is the same person if the one on Earth is still there. And that's where we start to get into this. Maybe before I talk about my position, what do you two think happens in this circumstance? Or
just so we all have the same picture here. So the idea is that, well, traveling to Mars takes a long time. So they come up with a different way. They say, well, okay, they scan you, and then they take the information, and then it's like they laser print you on Mars. Can we say that?
Yeah, sure.
Something like that. So the material is different. There's no matter, so to speak. Well, there's the information, but it's not that you are sent in terms of your matter. It's the information. So if we are information, which we are according to your perspective, then if the laser printing succeeds perfectly, there we are on Mars now. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, excellent. Now the issue might be that, well, if you just scan me here, and then now you say it's done, now you're on Mars, I would say, no, I'm not on Mars. I'm in Sweden. And so that's not me. Obviously, I'm here. I know I'm here.
Isn't it a point of view thing, though, that from the point of view of the person being on Mars, you're on Mars, and from the point of view of the person being on Earth, you're on Earth, and the person on Earth has no clue of what the person on Mars is doing or thinking. They share the background, but I guess the thing is that what's interesting is, would you be the person on Earth or would you be the person on Mars? right? It's like the universe has split in some sense.
Yeah, you're alluding to what's often called a branching event, Peter.
Yeah.
Where in some sense perhaps they have the same history, and they were the same person, but maybe going forwards they're not the same person. Is the idea that people discuss.
So what should we answer what our intuitions are? Peter, what is your intuition? Ariel, you did a great job listing the various possible responses. So I think it's like either you say that I'm still in Sweden and I'm not on Mars, or you say now I'm on Mars, I'm no longer in Sweden.
Or you could be neither.
Or you say I'm both in Mars and in Sweden.
Yeah, for a snapshot sort of idea. Those are your possibilities. I think it's actually even a little bit more complicated than that, but I think that's how initially people start thinking about it.
Yeah, it's not often this happens to me, so it's hard to answer. I guess I would be disappointed if I wanted to go to Mars in the teleporter and I'm still back on Earth. So maybe that's my answer, that I would be one of the two.
I would say the same. I would probably say that it's a copy on Mars who thinks it's me, but I know I'm here. I mean, I know I made this procedure, I agreed to it and everything, but I find myself here in Sweden.
Yeah, from an outside perspective, there would be two me, but from my point of view, there would only be a continuation of my life, if that's on Mars or on Earth. Yeah.
I guess the flippant response I would have, Patrick, is the version on Mars feels like now there's just a copy in Sweden. And like it's the real one that's going forwards. But my more serious response is, I think what this sort of thought experiment gets to is the discrepancy between consciousness as experienced in the moment, so our point of view at any particular point in time, and our continuity of self or personal identity across time and space. Now, normally those two, they never come apart from each other. We can remember previous moments from our past, we can imagine future scenarios, but there's never a circumstance where we're worried about branching, splits, being in two places at once. That's unnatural. In this sort of duplication scenario, it's like we have two futures ahead of us, where like one will be on Mars and one will be on Earth, and the points of view of both have the same past history. Both the Mars and the Earth version remember stepping into the teleporter, remember their previous life history up until that branching point. But now there's two different consciousnesses instead of just one. And there's a few different relevant questions that come in there. I guess one is, are they still the same person or not? And I actually, I think not that much hinges on the answer to that question, because I think the key thing is, does either the Earth or the Mars individual count for the survival of the person who stepped into the teleporter in the first place? And I think essentially that, yes, either counts for the survival of the individual who stepped into the teleporter in the first place. And that either you can think there was a branching event, so now that person is split into two, or you can think actually in some way, at least for a period of time after the duplication event, the two are the same individual, the same way that somebody can be the same individual over time, despite some loss of memories or changes or other sort of circumstances. That's how I'd initially start thinking about this, and I can get into the details of why I frame it that way if you'd like.
Patrick, I was thinking about, we had Travis Timmerman as a guest on Levity a few episodes ago. And you talked a lot about, increasing the good in life, the intrinsicness of good. Would it be morally wrong if this technology was invented? Let's play with this. If this technology was invented, would it be morally wrong to not pursue this avenue? Because you could increase the goodness in life by essentially making more Patricks in the world.
If I am a hedonist, and I think that the good in my life is to maximize happiness, then it would seem that if I hold Ariel's view of who I am, essentially my identity, then I should produce not just a copy on Mars, but copies on every planet of myself.
Well, hold on. There's two different things, right? There's like one's view of personal identity and survival, and one's like ethical framework about like moral views. I guess you could be a utilitarian hedonic philosopher and think like, oh, it's not important that I duplicate. The important thing is I find the happiest possible entity and I shove them through the duplicator as many times as I can and just like, you know, utility monster my way to hedonistic world that way. Whether one that counts for survival and whether it maximizes utility or welfare, I guess two different questions.
No, I shifted my answer towards somebody who's just a hedonist, not necessarily an altruistic hedonist.
Oh, sorry. So, that's my mistake.
So if you're just somebody who believes that the ultimate good in summon bone, the ultimate good in life is to maximize pleasure, then if I could multiply myself, then I would multiply my chances of pleasure, creating pleasure. So, but okay, Ariel, so it's good that you brought it back to the main topic, which is death and whether this is survival. And I just have a hard time seeing it as such. Because, you know, if this happens, there's no, now I am on Mars, you tell me, to me, but I know I'm sitting here, and if somebody said, now Patrick, you can not die, you know, even if you now swallow this pill and you go, and here in Sweden, you no longer exist, you didn't die because you are on Mars now. And I would say, no. I'm not going to go for that. I don't think I'm all of a sudden going to find myself on Mars just because I have this me on Mars. I know I'm here, and I'm very afraid of dying here. Copies anywhere else. I'm sorry, I shouldn't call it copies. That's begging the question, but duplicate or doppelganger or what have you. Exists. I don't feel it helps me to survive at all. Sorry, but I'm begging the question, of course. So, but here intuitions collide a lot. Sorry.
Yeah, let's take that seriously. So let's imagine, you know, that you step through the teleporter. You seem to stay on Earth. The other version went to Mars, and an hour later, you know, they're as per thought experiment, hellish torture conditions, someone's like, I'm going to shoot you now, but it's okay because, you know, you're on Mars and we need your organs to give to someone else or something. I don't know what it is. But yeah, there's the question of
kill me because I exist on Mars as well as here. So
yeah,
you can't kill
exactly.
me. I'm immortal,
yeah.
Which is great, but I just don't quite buy it.
Yeah. So the question I have when I'm trying to analyze this is, on the one hand, yes, the entity that is conscious there, that's being threatened with destruction, feels as though it's going to die. So that individual feels as though they're going to die. Because, you know, they don't feel as though their consciousness will continue to exist on into the future. And they feel like their memories will be lost. If we step to a third-person perspective instead of a first-person perspective, what's going to happen in this circumstance is there's going to be, you know, an hour of memories that are going to be lost, that no longer will be accessible. But it seems like the rest of that individual's psychological properties will still be held onto by the Mars entity. And so you could flip this around another way and you can say, oh, hold on, isn't this quite similar though to, imagine you step through the teleporter, you were awake for another hour or so, and then you took an amnestic drug, which wiped the last hour of memories, like everything that happened since you stepped through the duplicator, and then you were just transported to Mars. So under that circumstance, what would happen is, you know, there'd be the experience of being there in the room, on Earth still, like there would have been an entity experiencing all of that, but then those memories, those experiences would be lost forever, and then you would just wake up on Mars as though you'd initially stepped through the teleporter. And it seems now the intuitions are very different, right? Like most people don't feel like someone's been killed. They just feel like, oh, someone was harmed by having an hour of their memories lost. Even though now from a third-person perspective, later on, it seems like basically the same things happened in both circumstances. Now, I take it to be the case that given the third-person perspective looks like that, And given that I think that someone survives based on, the continuity of psychological properties, not based on the continuity of their body, and given I think a person can survive things like breaks in consciousness, like when they are under anesthesia or hypothermia or any of those other sorts of circumstances, I end up concluding that indeed, if you kill one of the two branches, destroy one of the two branches, the person has actually survived. And that it's just bad to do because, from the point of view of the individual who's about to be destroyed, they don't know it's going to work. It still feels like suffering. It still feels like something that's bad for them, even though I'd argue that they do survive in some sense. Now, I'm not saying we should do that. I think that's like a bad sort of practical thing. And if this technology ever becomes available, I'd suggest not doing that to people. But that is what leads me to conclude that actually it is a case of survival in that weird circumstance.
It's interesting how intuition clashes. I mean, there could be such an emulation running right now. Let's say Chinese scientists are doing this. And there is this copy that's constantly updating of me. So should I then feel comfortable taking, let's say, a poisonous pill that kills us? Should I say, oh, don't worry, I can't die because there's right now there's a copy waiting to be plugged in China of me. I don't feel comfortable at all. I'd say I like the biostasis, and I why not try the mind uploading, the digital snapshot? But I probably wouldn't be comfortable with just the digital snapshot.
I think normally we track our own survival from a first-person perspective, and it's comfortable to not have to worry about these philosophical issues of would I survive or not survive. Like, I too would prefer to just take an anti-aging pill and get to discard all of this sort of stuff. Like, I'm interested in pursuing these ideas primarily because, I think they're the only viable option that's likely to be available to at least people dying in the next few years or so. But that being said, there's pragmatic considerations why even I guess wouldn't want to do this if I had alternatives. On the other hand, though, if we're playing with thought experiments, maybe you're already a Chinese emulation, there's examples where I think that's the philosopher, maybe Mark Walker is his name, has this idea where, maybe you would find out that every time you go to sleep at night, you're actually being, run through something like the teleporter, where you're being destroyed and then recreated in the morning when you wake up. And if you found that out, you thought you were surviving by having the same body, but then someone proved to you that actually you were being destroyed and recreated all the time, would you then be like, oh, I'm actually just a copy, I haven't survived? Or would you be like, no, I guess that's really weird, but it doesn't matter. I'm still me, in a sense. There's all these circumstances where you can make people's intuitions go one way or the other.
It's my intuition that no, I don't think I can exist in many different places at the same time. And it's no comfort for me that there's a perfectly running copy of me somewhere. That I am somewhere else. It doesn't seem good enough for me. But on the other hand, that doesn't give me a positive view of what identity is grounded in.
That's fair. The one final possibility that sometimes people do is you can give up on the notion of personhood and survival and continuity. So Parfit kind of does this, where he ends up, I think, concluding that there's not really a strong case to be made for survival through personal identity over time, and other people argue for a no self sort of view where there just is no such thing as a person that coheres over time. And I guess you can hold that argument, but I just don't think it's how most people pragmatically operate or really feel at the end of the day. And I think that if you want to hold on to a notion of personhood, then the view I'm advocating is the best candidate. But sorry, I interrupted you, Patrick.
That's good. I think we had Anders Sandberg. I think he holds a view that's like that. Someone like him wakes up every morning. That's the most he can say, right? Which it's not very, as you say, it's not very pragmatic, because it means that the guy we invited to our podcast didn't show up, but someone else did.
He's the sum total of Anders-like processes.
Yeah.
Another aspect of this, Ariel, when talking about continuity and identity, is that somewhat provocatively, you say in the book that most people that we consider dead are not really dead, right? From an information theory perspective. Can you explain what you mean by that and how we should maybe revise our view of what death really is?
Yeah, I guess I'm not quite sure I say most people we consider dead aren't actually dead, but I do think it's the case that most people think that there's a much clearer definition of death than actually exists and is generally, particularly in a historical context. But maybe I'll give that historical context and then I'll explain. So prior to the middle of the 20th century or so, people were considered dead just based on, their heart stopped or their lungs stopped. Because at that time point, if that happened, there wasn't really anything you could do for someone. Then with the invention of things like mechanical ventilators to help people breathe, even if their lungs had failed, or cardiopulmonary bypass machines to help them have blood flow, even if their hearts had stopped, people came to realize there needed to be a more sophisticated definition of death. And in the 1970s and the 1980s, particularly in the US, there were ethicists and legislators and doctors who came together to come up with a more formal, at least legal definition of death. And that had two definitions within it. One was sort of the old school defining someone as dead based on irreversible cessation of heart and lung functions. But the newer version was based on irreversible cessation of all functions of the brain, which was termed brain death. And it is the case that nowadays there are a number of people who, for example, in a hospital setting, will be kept on life support such that they still have some lung and heart, activity, at least as provided by machine support, but who have no ongoing brain function anymore, and as a result are declared brain dead. And they will then have that life support turned off. But even at the time, people realized there were issues with the brain death definition of death. And there were two main issues. The first was that the definition said irreversible loss of all brain functions. But if you look at the brains of people declared brain dead, but kept on life support, you'll often still see some bits of the brain functioning. So in particular, a region like the hypothalamus, which controls like body temperature and some instincts, is still often functioning in those brain dead individuals. And doctors just say, but that doesn't really count. Like we're happy to ignore that. I agree with them based on my views, but it is a problem for that legal definition of death, as other doctors and legislators have noted. There was, in fact, in the US recently a push to try and have this problem acknowledged. The second problem with the brain death definition is it's based on irreversible cessation of all brain functions. And the thing is, like, technology continues to get better and better, and what was irreversible doesn't necessarily stay irreversible. So in the same way that heart and lung function loss was once irreversible, and now we have heart machines, lung machines of increasingly good versions, you can see the same thing starting to happen with brain implants and neural prostheses. And so the question then is, like, if we keep pushing that technology further and further and further, if we one day get to something like mind uploading technology, then how do we go along saying, where the line is for someone having died? What counts as someone having been destroyed if you can always replace lost brain function? And that's where this idea of defining someone as dead based on the loss of their personal identity information. So, not based on being unable to control their limbs or being unable to control their body temperature, but things like they don't have their memories, their personality, their way of being conscious, that being gone. And to phrase that in a less psychological or philosophical way and in a more computer science way is to say it's information theoretic death, or the personal identity specifying information that's gone. But they're really the same thing in different ways of phrasing. You mean in current settings? So it really depends on the health status of the individual prior to, their terminal phase. But if we assume that someone was neurologically healthy and they have something like an untimely cardiac arrest, I'm sitting here and then suddenly my heart stops. You see a process of things happening. So the first thing that happens is my neurotransmitters stop being released in a coordinated fashion in my brain. So in about 15 seconds, I'll lose consciousness as a result of that. Then there's a few minutes where my neurons still have enough energy to support themselves. They just can't communicate properly. Then after a few more minutes, those will start to lose power and you'll start to run into real trouble. And so the threshold for which at the moment we can, resuscitate people in sort of ideal hospital style settings is something like between 5 or 15 minutes or so, assuming someone's at room temperature when they have their heart attack. But that's not when, all the brain immediately breaks down after 20 minutes or so. You can look at brain tissue that's taken later, and you can still see synapses, you can still see neural connections that are present there. Probably it's the case that information, those connections, is still in there for maybe on the order of 36 hours or so, before it really breaks down to the point where under microscopes we can no longer distinguish it, and we think someone's connectome is probably destroyed. But this should... Yeah, what I will say, though, is there's heavy uncertainty with these sorts of estimates, and there's not enough work done to look at the ultrastructure, the microscopic structure of what's happening to synapses at different time points to really definitively say. It might be as soon as half an hour or so. It could be that it's even longer than 36 hours if you have the right way of visualizing the structures. It's quite unclear. Because at the moment, apart from people interested in brain preservation or cryonics, there's very little research that's being done on that sort of question. But it is the case that it's certainly not, as soon as someone is declared dead based on loss of heart activity, that their brains immediately is gone and there's no chance for them.
It's the brief window, then a lot of the cryonics patients might not be viable or resurrectable.
Yeah, this is my criticism of traditional cryonics practice, which is I think they have not put enough emphasis into really trying to test whether the connectome of individuals preserved with their practices is still intact, and those synapses, those brain connections are still there under the protocols that they have devised. And I mean, I applaud the fact that they're trying to do something to help people in these circumstances. And I acknowledge that it's logistically difficult to do research, to take these samples. But what I would like to encourage, and what the Brain Preservation Foundation that I work with would very much like to encourage, is a lot more rigorous investigation of, exactly how long does it take? Does your protocol ensure that the connectome is held onto? What's actually going on in these, patients' brains, or in animal models of these procedures that's happening? Because it may well turn out that, these procedures need to be done within 10 minutes, 15 minutes to hold on to someone's connectome. And if that turns out to be the case, then we need to improve what we're doing. Or on the other hand, it might turn out that we have much longer and, the viability window is quite large, in which case it'll be easier to do, and maybe even costs can be reduced by reducing the urgency. But in the absence of knowing that, I think we should be trying to get more feedback and work faster.
And this gets back to, how much we're spending today on taking care of terminally ill patients, and how we're completely neglecting the fact that we could actually save lives here if we just, looked at this problem from another viewpoint.
Yeah, insofar, basically, if one assigns any possibility that this preservation could work, whether it's through, eventual revival via uploading, or whether it's through reversal of the fixation procedure back into someone's original biological body, or any other means that haven't been devised yet. Basically, if you give it any non-trivial probability of working, then what you also have to do is ask, how much does it cost to do? And you weight the two of those together, probability of success versus cost, and you say, is this worth it? The question then is, how much does it cost to do these procedures? So at the moment, you have providers like tomorrow biostasis, doing cryopreservation for a few €100,000, I think, per procedure, including all the concomitant costs, like, establishing their business, having long-term trust, these sorts of things. But in principle, those costs could come down substantially. And particularly if you're doing something like chemical fixation, which is quite a lot cheaper, it might be possible to do for something like $10,000 per procedure as a marginal cost. And if something is really that cheap, basically if you give it any more than a few percentage chance of working, then I think there's a strong case to be made for it. And formally, the way that's done is you look at what we value in terms of like other procedures, like how much we're willing to pay for, operations or transplants or cancer therapies. And you normally see that in countries like Australia, and I'm guessing also Sweden, we're willing to pay something like $50,000, $60,000 per extra year of healthy life we can give someone. So, if you can give them through something like preservation, anything more than 3 or 4 years, it seems like it's a worthy proposal to be pursuing for the cost that I estimate that it might be.
You talk about the importance of actually doing these calculations, even though it might come across as morbid in the book. Can you explain a little bit about that?
This is not specific to preservation or anti-aging research. It's just a thing across all health economics where, in principle, we want to spend as much as we can to help every single person under all circumstances. But in practice, if you have something like a cancer therapy that costs $1 million and it only gives people on average an extra couple of months of life, it seems like maybe it might be better to spend that money on other treatments in other places that can give people substantially more time. And in the absence of infinite budgets, we have to make these sorts of trade-off decisions. And that holds for, particular treatments that insurance companies or healthcare departments might fund. It also occurs in sort of a research setting of like, why do we spend so much money on things that are common, like heart disease and cancer, than extremely rare genetic disorders? And it's because, it affects a lot more people and can provide maybe a lot more years of healthy living if you come through with a breakthrough. And I think it's just the case that, people haven't done these calculations seriously for things like brain preservation, let alone anti-aging. And so we're misallocating resources as a result.
Yeah, you're arguing that this should be the default. It should be default to preserve people who we, with our science today, deem to be dead, but do not, let's say, count as dead on your criterion, because there is a future science that could get their Connectome up and running again, right? Whether just through coming back from a cryo or by brain scanning, right?
Yeah, I think this is very much an option that should be available to people. Obviously, never forced upon them, much like no medical procedure should ever be forced upon people. But as a default accessible option for people that they can opt out of if they want to, absolutely, I think this is something as a society we should be providing to people and trying to make as cheap and accessible as possible.
It's an interesting dimension of your argument that when people answer these questions about how long they want to live and whether they want radical life extension, a lot of people are fearful that, well, I'll be the only one and everyone I know is going to be dead and so on. So what you say, no, this way we we push forward the culture too, or the context of us, that also in some sense contribute to who we are.
Yeah, I always think about this in the context of, historical sort of refugee precedents. So my grandparents, for example, were Holocaust survivors, and they thankfully, managed to survive with some of their family. But I heard stories about circumstances where there's a friend of mine's grandparent who lost his entire family, his entire village, all the people he knew during World War II. And then he moved to Australia with nothing, with no connections. And then he built for himself a new life here and ended up having a successful business and a new family and living into his 80s. And on the one hand, like, it's extremely tragic that he lost all of these things from his younger life. But on the other hand, he still had a very meaningful life that he made for himself once he moved to Australia. And I see some analogy there to the case of preservation, where even if individuals went it alone, I still think that would be meaningful for many people, even if some might not choose to. But it's so much better if you could take your friends and family and society with you. It's all the more enriching.
I mean, there is a justice angle there that is rarely mentioned, and that is, you talked about your ancestor and how they, I would say, sacrificed and struggled and then reaped the benefit of this. But I mean, a lot of immigrants don't themselves live to reap that much benefit of all their toils. They start out in a very difficult spot, and then they struggle, and then their children perhaps reap the benefit, and their grandchildren. And I feel that's a kind of generational justice issue that's really never talked about. But if we could preserve people to let them live later when we have the science to do so, that would take care of that problem. In some sense, they have sacrificed, but they haven't enjoyed the fruits of their labor. Now you would wake them up and they would be healthy again to enjoy the fruits of their labor. I mean, we sit here and enjoy all this fantastic technology and well-being thanks to the struggle of the unmentionable struggles that we probably wouldn't survive now if we were put into the 19th century, how ordinary people lived, right? When having shoes was something remarkable, right, for many people. So to, in some sense, repay the prior generations for getting us where we are. And that plays into your argument too about the future loves you, which is in a sense a hope. You're expressing the hope that the future loves us, something that we can influence. Can you say something about that?
No, that's a beautiful, capturing the essence of what the book's about and why that's the title of the book. Because I do think it's tragic that all these people that contributed to us being able to live safe, healthy lives that we live today don't get to enjoy those experiences. And I would love it if I could reach back and bring my grandparents and great-grandparents and all of the previous generations that led up to me into this, safer, healthier, happier world to enjoy that as well. That's not to say there aren't challenges and still problems today. Like there's wars, there's climate change, there's wealth inequality, there's existential risks like pandemics and nuclear war and AI and all sorts of things. So there's all these problems that we still need to solve. But my hope is very much that, if we manage somehow to not destroy ourselves and to continue the work of our ancestors in making this a better world, that there will come a time when our descendants live in sufficient luxury and safety that they might say, if the opportunity exists to bring back our ancestors and let them share this with us, then why not do so? That's the core of the intergenerational love that the book's about. Setting aside all the neuroscience and medicine and philosophy and practicalities and everything, and coming back to just like, why would one of people do it? It's like, because they want to live. They want their children to live. They love their families. They love their friends. My hope is that people will do these things and will succeed as individuals and as a society in, acting on that love.
And if we were to be reawakened or reanimated or whatever you would call it, I guess it's fair to assume that would be a fairly good society that would choose to do such a thing and would have the technology to do it.
It's much more likely to happen in societies that have gone well. Like if there's nuclear war, then everything just gets destroyed and no one's reviving their ancestors. If there's massive wealth inequality or impoverishment, there's not going to be the resources to focus on reviving ancestors. It seems like the balance of probabilities are worlds in which people get revived are worlds that are rich, where this is cheap, and there's social concern for helping empower individuals, bring back patients, and love towards one's ancestors. I guess you could even imagine a world in which the technology was there, but people felt such disdain towards previous generations that they never bothered to do it. I think it's really, mostly worlds in which things are going pretty well that it's likely to happen. And so that's an argument as well for keeping that in mind today and, trying to think about how do we make sure the future goes well, both for our descendants, but possibly for ourselves too.
It's kind of a moral heuristic, you could say, like, how should we act in such a way that the future loves us?
Yeah, that's how I think about it.
What do you think are the odds of people already having been cryopreserved today, that they could ever be living again?
I have a little bit of new data that's relevant to this, which is that I, late last year, ran a survey of a few hundred neuroscientists, not people who are, brain preservationists, cryonicists. These are just random neuroscientists, asking them, with what probability do you think that, these sort of ideal circumstance, chemical fixation style procedures actually hold on to the, personal identity defining information in someone's brain? I didn't ask them about revival, mind uploading style. Is this still the same person? I left the philosophy out of it. Just asking technically, can you hold on to this, information using today's techniques? What we found with the survey is a huge range of responses where some people said, yeah, definitely yes. I think there's a very good chance it could work. Some people were like, absolutely not. But the average response people gave was about 45% under these sorts of ideal circumstances. But again, the range was really wide, and I think actually the most common response was something like 70 or 75%. And so what I take this to mean is that, there's considerable uncertainty amongst the scientific community that this will definitely work. But there's also a pretty substantial probability, they think, that if done properly, and if the connectomes held onto, it could be made to work. And I think that there are, only logistical barriers to doing that well, rather than like fundamental scientific breakthroughs that need to happen to ensure that these procedures are provided to patients well. My own estimate is higher. I think, I think existential risk actually is most of the issue, that, this future just won't be able to because it's destroyed. I think there's a pretty good chance that if someone's brain is preserved well, that they'll be able to be brought back.
I think this is why, your book is excellent. It's very well written. I loved it. But I think it's also so extremely important for neuroscientists such as yourself to come out and say that, because often people dismiss this field as just pure science fiction. And I have to actually say to people that why they think, why I'm spending all this money to be cryopreserved. And I say that, it's better than irreversible death, right? But yeah, I acknowledge that it's just like buying a lottery ticket. But after reading your book, I feel like it's actually not like buying a lottery ticket. The chances of actually surviving this is higher than that.
Yeah, I think it's more like an investment. Where there's considerable risk, but also considerable rate of return potentially possible from it.
The way I think about it is that the preservation technique now is in some ways more important than the technology we'll develop later, because we'll develop all technology under the sun later, right? So yeah, I'm much more optimistic now after having read your book.
Yeah, that's the fundamental point I try and get across, which is we don't know how to do revival yet. We might be completely wrong. It might be easier. It might be harder. Who knows? But as long as you have the information in someone's brain, that specifies them, their memories, personality, all that sort of stuff, and as long as that's preserved well in a way that's not decaying or aging anymore, you've got as much time as you need to work out how to bring someone back.
If we die this year and for some reason the technology of biostasis has evolved to really do a good job, when do you think we would wake up, or what would be the year?
I think it depends on how optimistic you are about, scientific progress and AI progress timelines. I did actually ask about when we might be able to do the first emulations in the survey that I mentioned before. So for example, there was the first kind of bad, not not a true emulation, but kind of like a crappy emulation of a fly brain, was published late last year. And in the survey, we asked about when do you think the first mouse and when do you think the first human could be done? And I think the sort of average responses were like maybe a mouse in the 2040s or so. And then for a human, they were much more like longer timelines. I think the average response was something like, oh, not till the 2100s or so, like early 2100s. But my guess is like if we continue to see strong sort of AI development, if we continue to see computing power progress as it has been, where I think we've had computing power increase of something like 100 million-fold power in the past 30 years, that something like doing an emulation of a human will be possible fairly soon. And I mean, when I say soon, I mean in a matter of decades, like 3 or 4 decades, not a matter of years. And if you believe that an emulation and upload counts as survival, I guess that's when I think the first revivals would be possible. If it turns out you're waiting for something like, directly fixing someone's body and biologically restoring them, then I think we'll be waiting a substantial period of time longer. But I don't know how long for that.
Yeah, I was just thinking about emulation. I mean, if you are a digital entity in some fashion, I mean, then you're also vulnerable to all the stuff that computers are vulnerable to. I mean, have you thought anything about that and what that would be like to maybe live your life in virtual worlds and the dangers inherent in being a computer, essentially?
Yeah. So the key thing for me is that I think an emulation that's done well would feel from the inside exactly as I do now. Almost by definition, that's what would count as having done it well for survival. Where like I can't just introspect and know I'm made of flesh and blood and that I run on, neural activity. I just feel like I am. And if you replace those materials with new materials, then so be it. But I do keep in mind that, if I was made of different stuff, I'd have different problems where I'd no longer be able to get bacterial infections or cancer. That'd be great. But I guess now I can be hacked and get computer viruses instead of biological viruses, and that would be bad. I guess I would just hope that the overall safety profile would be better than it is now. And like, I certainly know now I'm aging and my risk of death is increasing exponentially. So I would just hope that it wasn't that circumstance. But I agree there'd be a whole host of new problems that you'd have in exchange for the ones that we currently do. And that gets explored in science fiction and ideas and all over the place.
Have you signed up for cryonics yourself yet? Or how do you view that? I mean, you have such specific views on how you want this to be done, this procedure.
So I live in Melbourne, Australia. If I had a sudden cardiac arrest, I think I'd just be pretty screwed at the moment. Thankfully, I'm 32, so my risk of dying is only about 1 in 1,000, and probably less for someone who's of my particular demographic. But if it turned out I had a terminal diagnosis, so I went to the GP and it turns out I've got cancer, I would go, if it was aggressive and going to kill me very soon, I'd probably go to Oregon brain preservation in the West Coast. And soon I might also sign myself up with Connectome that are hoping to do really fast procedures, so within like 10, 15 minutes or so. And they're also initially planning to offer on the West Coast of the US. If I couldn't get those quick chemical preservation procedures, I guess I'd still end up opting for preservation with traditional cryopreservation, unhappy as I am with the current level of Connectome integrity that they seem to have verified. But yeah, that's where I'm currently thinking about it.
And your book has created a lot of attention, right? I saw there was an article about you in The Guardian, for example. What has been the reaction? So
on the one hand, it's been great that I've been able to go on book tour, speak to journalists, newspapers, give talks at universities and the Royal Institution and other places. But it's not like I've, started going on tour and immediately public sentiment's shifted and it's got billions of dollars and everyone's changing. I think these things are incremental where, you get more people to come out of the woodwork and say, actually, maybe this isn't completely insane. Maybe there's some merit to it. And I run the survey and I find that actually a substantial chunk of neuroscientists think that, that this is an idea that has some technical merit to it. And I guess my hope is by doing the book and doing the tour, it'll just become easier and easier to come into the public as like someone who's sympathetic to this pursuit, whether it's anti-aging generally or whether it's brain preservation specifically. And hopefully we will see increasing growth in the months and years to come. But yeah, I'd really like to see the providers both increase in number and increase in volume, and that's what I'm actively working on trying to help with at the moment.
It's interesting, there was a survey you mentioned in your book of both people who work on consciousness and also people who worked in neuroscience, and most of them had a substrate kind of a neutral view and believed that consciousness could exist in also perhaps in non-biological form.
Yeah, I think, I mean, most neuroscientists are functionalists, which is basically that, what determines, what the things that are conscious are things that perform particular functions, like they can introspect or talk or, have particular ways of thinking, essentially. That's for consciousness. And yeah, if you hold that view, then, all sorts of things might be conscious, either current AIs or AIs in the future, other animals, even aliens. But there's other views as well that, are still compatible with not just biological creatures being conscious. I think it's quite a small set of both philosophers and neuroscientists who think that consciousness is intrinsically and forever only tied to biological creatures. That camp is called biological naturalism. It does have some clever philosophers who are proponents. I think like Peter Godfrey Smith, for example, might be one of the proponents of it, but it's a less common view than the other.
We ask our guests to recommend 3 books. Have you thought of any?
So 3 books. I guess 4, because one is Patrick's book, which I think is a good overview of the case for against death or for life, in a sense. 3 other books, though. One is sort of an exploration of, what the future might be like in a real sense, in like 100 years or 200 years from now, and how it would be like very weird and still have problems, but still quite possibly much better than the world today. And that's a set of science fiction books called the Terra Ignota series by Ada Palmer, who's a historian of the Renaissance, but also a science fiction writer. So that's one. 2 would be the health economics book, The Right Price, by Newman and others, which is actually a very readable, even though it's a textbook, account of, where do the prices of drugs come from? How do we decide which treatments to fund or which treatments not to fund, which I found very interesting. And then a 3rd book might be, I'm going to go with the Ibis trilogy by Amistav Ghosh, which is just a book about various characters in India and China just prior to the first Opium War. And I'm recommending it because, I've really enjoyed it as a series. It was very entertaining. And I guess the point of wanting to live longer is to be able to read more entertaining books amongst other pursuits. And that's a fun one. So even if you only have limited time, that might be worth some of your time.
Thank you. It was fantastic to have the opportunity to talk to you.
A pleasure to speak to you both. Thanks for having me on. It's nice to see more people sort of doing communication in this space, trying to push things. It's good.
Yeah, it's great to have a community of like-minded people.